All right, so Pete Buttigieg has been on an absolute tear recently, and by that I mean he has been tearing up any potential shot that he might have at becoming the president one day, which is exactly what he wants to do, and that is exactly why he decided to take this deal with Joe Biden back in the Democratic primaries in order to become his Secretary of Transportation, okay? And, honestly, this guy, Pete Buttigieg, we all know who he is, right? I mean, he's basically been trying to do his Obama impression, right? I'm a young guy, I'm, outwardly progressive, but really just like a neoliberal corporate shill. And in this position at the Department of Transportation, he has basically just been completely screwing up every chance that he has had to do things that are popular and that are the right policy decisions. And so one of the most recent fuck-ups that Pete Buttigieg has been, I think, largely responsible for has been the utter chaos that unfolded over the holidays, Christmas and New Year's, where Southwest Airlines, one of the major air carriers in this country, completely botched their holiday travel plans and essentially left thousands and thousands of Americans stranded over the holidays. And the statistics on how many flights they managed to delay or cancel are just absolutely insane, and I'll show you some of those here in a second. But here from Common Dreams, Jake Johnson, I think he outlays some of the failures of Pete Buttigieg during this entire crisis and leading up to this crisis in a pretty succinct way. Okay, so here from Jake Johnson. He's failed to take real action. Buttigieg under fire for handling of airline debacle. Okay, so just remember, as a pre-context to this, going throughout the last couple of months, we knew that there were already problems at the airlines, right? I mean, it was months ago that we knew about pilot shortages because all of these airlines had fired a bunch of people and furloughed a bunch of people, and so they basically created an artificial shortage because they wanted to squeeze a little bit more profits for their shareholders, right? They have refused to make adequate investments in upgrading tech and all of their infrastructure and that good stuff and hiring more workers just so they can ship it off to Wall Street ghouls, right? So that's sort of like the background of this. That's been happening for a very long time, probably for decades in this country, since we've had the further monopolization of the airline industry, the deregulation of the industry, the increased privatization of it. And so this has been a long time in the works, but especially during the Biden administration, it's not as if this Southwest airline collapse was something that could not have been possibly foreseen. Okay, so here to start us off, he says Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg is facing growing backlash from members of Congress and corporate watchdogs who say his department failed to take sufficient action in the lead up to mass flight cancellations surrounding the Christmas holiday, a meltdown that has its roots in decades of airline consolidation, greed, and lax oversight. And on Thursday, Representative Khanna took to Twitter to argue that, quote, this mess with Southwest could have been avoided, singling out the airline responsible for the overwhelming majority of recent flight cancellations in the United States. And just to put that in perspective for you guys, if you actually look at the data, there were some days, okay, this one I think is specifically from back in December early. Let's see what date this has on it. Yeah, so this was back from a couple of weeks ago, but this was just on one day as an example of, December 26th, where more than 50% of all flights canceled in the entire world were Southwest Airlines flights. Okay, so initially some people were saying, oh, maybe this is due to the weather and winter storms and all of that good shit. No, it wasn't, because you didn't have any of these other airlines that were fucking up nearly to the degree that Southwest was. Okay, so this was purely something where it was like they had hyper-specific, issues that are, examples of how broader problems within this industry could have been addressed a long time ago. This just happened to be their turn to have this massive collapse, right? So again, this was something that was disproportionately Southwest Airlines, but there are larger lessons to be learned here in terms of the privatization and the corporate greed that goes behind a lot of these industries, which honestly, in my opinion, I think should just be nationalized. I think that flights and our rail networks as well, which I'll touch back on again in a second here when we remind ourselves of Pete Buttigieg's handling of the rail strike and all of that good stuff with the paid sick leave negotiations. But I think a lot of these industries would be much better suited if we treated them as public services, which is really what they are at a fundamental level, instead of as these massive profit-driven machines that diminish the experience of customers, that diminish the working conditions of average people who work at these places, and it just leads to a whole bunch of different consequences to have these be held in the hands of these private individuals or Wall Street investors. So They continue here, giving a little bit more detail. They say Khanna noted that he joined Senator Bernie Sanders earlier this year in urging the Department of Transportation to implement fines and penalties on airlines for canceling flights after a wave of cancellations during a July 4th travel surge. So again, this wasn't something that hasn't happened before, right? And this one I think was more broad scope with multiple different airlines, not just Southwest. But they say that Sanders specifically called for a fine of $27,500 per passenger for all domestic flights that are delayed more than 2 hours and all international flights that are delayed for more than 3 hours when passengers are forced to wait on the tarmac, as well as a fine of $15,000 per passenger for all domestic flights that are delayed for more than 2 hours. And Khanna asks, why were these recommendations not followed? That's a good question. That seems like a pretty fair punishment for a lot of these corporations, these airlines that are essentially misleading people, lying to customers and consumers, and screwing over their experience. Okay, so this is something that is, a broad-reaching problem. Specifically with Southwest, it looks like it had a lot to do with them not upgrading their tech infrastructure. So they didn't even know where a lot of their pilots were. They didn't know where a lot of their, flight attendants were, and so it all got botched. But this goes a lot deeper than that. Obviously, there are problems with, overbooking and all of these other policies that these airlines deliberately engage in, where they'll know that they don't have a pilot for a specific flight and still book it anyways because the consequences of fucking over their passengers just don't outweigh the benefits of accumulating all of this money. So they continue, saying that William McGee, who also had a critique of this, a senior fellow for aviation and travel at the American Economic Liberties Project, argued Thursday that while there's plenty of blame to go around for the latest cancellation crisis, Secretary Buttigieg has spent months appearing to regulate rather than actually regulating. That is exactly what he does, right? Again, this is a guy who wants to pretend like, oh, I'm the big, problem solver. I'm, going to be aggressive and tough with these people. But really all he does is like essentially the equivalent of what Hillary Clinton did when she was talking about how she cracked down on the big banks, when really what she meant at the end of the day was that she like finger wagged at them and said, you better cut out all of this nefarious, borderline illegal behavior, and just expected them to fall in line. Same thing that Joe Biden does on a very regular basis, where he'll just sort of like mildly call out corporations or billionaires as if that's going to be enough to get them to do the right thing, as if you don't actually need increased fines like Bernie and Roe were just proposing, or increased regulations, or increased tougher, policies surrounding these industries. Basically, Pete Buttigieg is, again, a neoliberal shill through and through. And so basically his limitations on what he is willing to do are dictated by what he would say is the free market, right? He'll say, oh, we live in a capitalist country, so it's not my job to impose these things or force these things on these companies. I just have to try to use, my ability to influence the market by, mildly criticizing them and mildly pushing back at them and maybe writing them a letter every once in a while, and that'll be enough to, fix this industry, right? It's completely pathetic. It's completely ridiculous, but that's Pete Buttigieg, right? So they continue with another quote here from the same guy saying, how do I know this? Because I've spent thousands of hours annually for 23 years fighting those airlines. Those of us in advocacy trenches can testify to the Department of Transportation's inaction. And he says, criticizing Buttigieg's lack of action is neither unfair nor inaccurate. When advocates met with him in 2021, most of us were impressed and optimistic, but he's failed to take any real action, and he has broad powers to act on unfair and or deceptive acts, and airlines have done both. And he added, Southwest was inevitable after he failed to punish awful behavior all year. So again, we had the similar problem back in July, and Pete Buttigieg basically just said, well, we've fixed the problem. I mean, we're going to play this video here from The Lever. They put together a great montage of how all of this really unfolded. But I mean, again, at the end of the day, this is something he said he was going to be able to sort out, right? He said, we are going to be prepared for the holidays. And obviously, because of his little, finger wagging, and that being the limitations of how much he's willing to do to actually crack down on these companies, obviously it completely imploded in on itself. And so I wanted to play this video here that, again, was put out here by The Lever. I'll link it down below if you guys want to go subscribe to them or watch their, news as it comes out every day. But, great work by The Lever here. They really killed it with this one. So let's just go ahead and watch this.
Do you think this issue will be sorted in time for the holidays?
I think it's going to get better by the holidays.
I wasn't anticipating a nightmare, but it became a nightmare. It did.
16,000 canceled flights.
Passengers forced to sleep at airports, luggage scattered from city to city.
Again, your bags will not be here.
4 months before Southwest's mass cancellations, 38 state attorneys general from both political parties sent a joint letter to congressional leaders explicitly calling out Buttigieg's transportation department for failing to respond and provide appropriate recourse for frustrated airline flyers.
Okay, so it wasn't just Bernie, it wasn't just Khanna, it wasn't just those other advocacy groups that we just went through. It was 38 state attorneys general were also calling on them to do more about this. Did he do any of it? Absolutely not.
Buttigieg's agency has continued to do almost nothing to prevent all of this from happening again. He hasn't fined any of America's largest airlines for unpaid refunds or mass flight cancellations, despite thousands of consumer complaints.
We've seen a lot of improvement from this summer when I called on the airlines to step up their game.
Okay, again, when I called on the airlines to step up their game, right? That's what he thinks his job is as the head of the Department of Transportation, okay? This is a guy who has literally more power over our transportation systems, our different sectors, whether it's rail or airlines or anything like that. This guy has more power in that field than anybody else in the country, and his limitation is just to be like, well, you know, I called on them to fix the problems. I mean, what else am I supposed to do about it, right? I mean, this is neoliberalism for you, right? And one of the funniest things that I saw from Pete Buttigieg, I didn't pull it up for this video specifically, but as he has been getting all of this criticism from all over the place about his mishandling of this latest thing, but generally just critiques of him as a head of the Department of Transportation, right? He actually tweeted a couple days ago a link to a Washington Post article that was for some reason saying that he was going too hard on some of these airlines, and he tweeted it out and said, "We at the Department of Transportation are prepared to take on criticisms like this. We will continue fighting for the American people." He was actually trying to pretend as if the problem here is that maybe he's been going too hard on these companies. Okay, so that's where his mindset is at this point, right? While all of these other people, these state attorneys general, the advocacy groups, multiple politicians within his own party are calling on him to do more, he seems to think that he's borderline maybe doing too much right now.
How many of Senator Sanders' calls to action are actively being considered?
Well, we've seen a lot of improvements, especially with airline delays and cancellations.
Passengers are sleeping in airport hallways.
The airlines received billions of dollars in bailout money during COVID and aid during COVID.
Their systems needed to be upgraded for some time, and the airline knew that. It's just that they diverted their funds elsewhere.
I mean, come on. Like, come on, what do you even say to this, right? Billions of dollars given to this industry at the beginning of COVID, okay? Well, you know, average Americans, obviously you're not going to give each person $1 billion, but, you know, average Americans get crumbs in the form of like maybe $1,400 in stimulus checks or whatever. These motherfuckers got billions of dollars for their companies to invest in things like, I don't know, maybe upgrading your tech infrastructure so that you know where your employees are at any given time. But instead, they choose to do what with this money? I guess spend it on stock buybacks, I guess spend it on, you know, upgrading and giving a pay raise to the CEO who's doing an absolutely fantastic job, apparently, right?
Should Southwest have known that these types of delays would occur?
In my opinion, yes. Our scheduling IT infrastructure is outdated and can't handle the massive cancellations that had to happen that day when the weather event occurred. It can't keep track of where pilots are, flight attendants are, and airplanes are. And they said they're, you know, working on it, but of course the investment wasn't made.
You would think that that might be like somewhat of a top priority for an airline company to invest in knowing where your pilots, your airplanes, and your flight attendants are. I don't know, call me crazy. I'm no, you know, a master's in business administration or anything like that, but it seems like something that I would invest in if I actually gave a shit about improving the experience for customers or, you know, actually improving the business in any way, shape, or form. But I guess they have better ideas over there at Southwest.
I'm truly sorry. We are the first airline to be able to reinstate our dividend, and not only that, but reinstate it in full.
Thousands of people stranded and desperate to get home.
What's going on? Why are you selling something that you're not providing?
As I press the airlines to enhance their customer service plans, to do it in writing.
How can travelers have faith in the airline? And to be frank, have faith in your department as a watchdog if these problems keep happening?
I mean, again, it's basically all summarized in that last statement there by Pete, right? I pressed the airlines to enhance their customer service plans. I even asked them to do it in writing. What does that even mean? I mean, genuinely, what does that mean? Listen, I mean, again, what that CEO of Southwest was just saying back then, okay? What he was just saying, where he said, we're the first, airline to be able to reinstate our full quarterly dividends to shareholders. That's all that this boils down to. These CEOs, these boards of directors, these corporations are operating under the model, under the constraints of shareholder capitalism. So all they give a shit about is returning maximum profits to their shareholders. Point blank, period. Okay, and if that requires diminishing the working conditions, the safety for their workers, if it means cutting their benefits or cutting their wages, then that's what they'll do. If it means diminishing the consumer experience, the customer side of this equation, by screwing over people with excess fines, or delaying or canceling their flights during the holidays, right, then that's what they'll do. Because the alternative to that would mean actually diverting some of that money they're shelling out to their shareholders and making investments in the company, making it a more productive and efficient company, making their workers, improving their working conditions, improving their lives in material ways, right? That's where that money would be going. So they can't have that. So again, I mean, this boils down to my basic fundamental critique of having a capitalist mode of production, especially within these types of industries, right? If it's public transportation, well, this obviously isn't public transportation. I think it should be considered public transportation. But if it's transportation, if it's housing, if it's healthcare, if it's pharmaceuticals, if it's any basic necessities that people need to engage with the world, that they need to engage with on a daily basis or on a regular basis, those should be things that are socially covered as a society, as a country, right? Those should not be things that are in the hands of private individuals or private enterprises that have absolutely no goal other than to extract maximum profits from this industry and ship it off to Wall Street shareholders. That's their only goal. So of course you're going to have lack of investment in actually improving and improving their IT infrastructure, right, and making sure that they can keep track of everybody. Of course you're going to have that incentive. That is inevitable, which is why it is the job, or supposed to be the job, of a government within a democratically run society. It is supposed to be the job of somebody like, I don't know, the head of the Department of Transportation, to maybe force them to make the right decisions, because they're not going to do it by themselves when their only incentive is profit maximization. So that's your whole job, Pete, okay? Your job is to regulate. Your job is to impose fines. Your job is to crack down on them, and that doesn't mean just signing a letter or maybe giving a mild public critique or saying, well, I've really been pressing them behind the scenes to shape up and get better. I mean, it's just like the most pathetic shit you could possibly imagine. And again, this isn't the only example of this type of thing that we have seen from Pete. I mean, obviously I talked about this on my channel, but going back to the rail strike, I mean, this guy was straight up directly asked by this MSNBC anchor during this interview, does the Biden administration support, including Bernie Sanders' amendment to give 7, I think it was, paid sick days to these workers? And he refused to answer the question. He was just like, oh, we're just going to go with the deal that the unions already rejected, and that's the position of the Biden administration. This isn't the place for the government to step in and make sure that these rail workers are given like below the bare necessities from these companies that are largely owned by billionaires like Warren Buffett and other Wall Street investment firms. It's not our job to be an impediment on the free market, as he calls it. It's our job to just sort of like be the overseers and like, you know, maybe give them a little bit of advice as to how they could improve with what they're doing, and then, you know, not stepping in to side with the workers aggressively, right? I mean, this is who Pete Buttigieg is, right? So just remember this for his future potential presidential ambitions, okay? Keep in mind that this is who he is, and keep in mind that this is the job that he asked for. He went out of his way to become the head of the Department of Transportation, probably thinking it was going to be a really easy, cozy job to bolster his resume, but he's had all of these major disasters that have been unfolding under him, which are not even just specifically his fault, but are a fault of the system in which he is operating within, and which is a system that he is doing everything in his power, everything throughout his career, in order to protect and preserve and to make sure we keep having to deal with for the foreseeable future.
Everyone is saying good Politic guy has the best Politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying
Bye.